Alright, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to start part 6, User Interfaces and Deployment. These are our last areas to discuss before we finally have our games ready to go. We will have covered all of the topics necessary to build a game, put a UI on it, have some gameplay, interact with our players, and deploy them so that other people can play them. So let's go ahead and get started. So let's first start off by talking about what is user interface. When we talk about the user interface of a game, we're talking about those components that are necessary for us to be able to show health bars, hearts for if you are dying or gaining health, special effects that will be related to text feedback on your screen, your menus that you would be clicking on, text that characters would be saying, dialogue boxes, things of that nature. All of those things are what we're talking about when we say user interface. So if you're talking about something very simple as the ones we saw previously, or something more complex, such as the Pip-Boy interface from Fallout, all of these things really have the same concepts from the perspective of Unity. You are displaying some bitmaps, some sprites of some sort that have some text output that are conveying information to the user. And that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we build that? What goes into constructing that? What goes into providing the feedback so that if your player, his health goes down or his health goes up, or her inventory increases or decreases, how is that represented on screen? How is that overlaid on top of the game? That's what we're going to talk about today. So in Unity, all of the things that are related to the user interface are all going to be under the UI grouping here. The first thing that we'll need to do is to create some sort of game object for us to be able to display our stuff on. In order to do that, let's go ahead and create a canvas. The canvas is the primitive that is used to display stuff on the screen. The next thing we want to do is make sure that we're in the 2D view. So this will ensure that we are looking at our canvas head on as opposed to at some angle. Unity's user interface doesn't have to just be a two-dimensional interface. Unity also supports being able to display user interfaces on objects, so you can design all of your game screens in Unity, attach it to a game object, and have the player view the input and output from that interface directly in the game. But we're going to be looking at primarily today are just the basics for an interface that we look at so that we can build menus, show health, and be able to show some sorts of feedback from the game to the player. Now, when we created our canvas, which as I mentioned before is our screen that we're going to be displaying, the first thing that we also got was an event system. And the event system is a special object in Unity. The event system is what gathers input from the user and gives those events to the various user interface components so that they can run any scripting that they need to do based off of the user's interaction with the user interface. Now, one of the things that we want to do is make sure that our UI is scaled properly. So let's click on the canvas. Remember, this is our screen overlay, and we want to make sure that we are displaying it at the same ratio that we're authoring it. So we'll go into the game view, and we will go into 16 by 9, just so that we have a fixed aspect ratio to work with. Then we'll also go back into the scene view for our canvas, and we want to make sure that everything here is also authored for 16 by 9 resolution. So here in the canvas scaler, this is what scales the content within your canvas if the resolution changes. Right now it's set to constant pixel size. Now I have no idea why Unity sets that as the default because it's rarely going to be what you want. Go ahead and change that to scale with screen size. So when you scale with screen size, as your screen size changes, and that could be different resolutions for different screens on the PC or on mobile devices, iPads, etc., etc. As you move your game between these different scenarios, you want your user interface to scale to accommodate that particular device. You don't want to have to build new user interfaces for every single screen, and that's what the Canvas scaler is doing. So we're telling it to scale with the screen. Now we also want to make sure that the reference resolution that we're using is going to be in a 16 by 9 sort of aspect ratio. And an easy way to do that, this reference resolution is abstract. This doesn't mean that you need an 800 by 600 screen. We can just tell it we are authoring everything for 1600 by 900. So what this means to Unity is everything that you're putting on the screen, I am going to assume that that is at a scale of 1600 by 900. So if you change your screen resolution, I am going to scale with that. And the reason that we chose that is because this game view that we're going to use to view our display is at 16 by 9. And so I want to have something that is equivalent in aspect ratio so that we can make adjustments and expect that what we see in the game view will be the same aspect ratio when we move to our devices. The next thing that we want to do is we want to create a background for our user interface so that it's easy for us to see the background of our screen and know that we are touching on something when we move this to an actual application surface such as a mobile device or similar. So in our scene view, we're going to go in UI and add a panel. Now this panel is basically the background of our scene. It has a particular color here. We can replace that with a material or an image, background image or something similar, and we'll do that a little bit later. But for right now, we have this set to be a simple source image background, which is alpha blended, so that you can see through it. We can change that and change the alpha channel all the way up to 255. So remember here, these colors RGB range from 0 to 255. So now if we actually switch over to our game view, we can see that we can no longer see through the user interface. We're basically looking at the background of our screen. One thing that's going to be useful for us while we are developing and debugging is to have our scene view and our game view next to each other so we're not tabbing back and forth. Just makes it a little bit easier to author content for the user interface. So I'll go ahead and do that here so that it's easier for us to see. So now that we have our background in place, we can go ahead and start putting components, user interface components, on top of this screen. The first one that's easy that typically we always want to do is we want to put some text there. So we'll go into UI and we'll add text. Now there are two types of text here, as well as buttons and so forth. There is the text, which is the basic text. That's the old school text from the old Unity system. Works just fine. You can still use it. Then there is text that uses Text Mesh Pro. Text Mesh Pro is a product that Unity acquired at some time within the past couple of years. It is an excellent product. It gives us a lot of functionality to do things with text which the old Unity text couldn't. So we will create all of our assets with Text Mesh Pro because this will give us the ability to do better things with fonts, drop shadows, and so forth. So let's go ahead and select Text Mesh Pro. On your interface, it may pop up and ask you to install some additional resources and some examples and so forth. I've already done that on this machine, but if it asks you to do that on your machine, feel free to go ahead and accept that. Press those buttons so that those assets are added to your project. So here I have the Text Mesh Pro resources already added to my project, so I don't need to do that. So what we have now in our scene is we have some text, and we can go to this Text Mesh Pro component and we can select it and say this is some text, and this text is basically being scaled to fit the size of the text box. and it has a color which is determined by the vertex color. So if we wanted to change that, we could select this, pick a new color, and that is the color of our text within this environment. It's kind of ugly, but it is what it is. We also can go in and resize this. Let's move this out of the way. Go back to our scaling tools. We can scale this out so that it is the size that we want it to be. We can go to our move tools and move this text where we need it to be. Notice that we only have two-dimensional transformations here because this is a 2D component. We're in the 2D transform space, which is where we want to be for user interfaces. So we've moved this text around. This little piece right here is the central anchor point for our canvas, and we'll come to that a little bit later. But now that we've got some text here, one of the first things that people typically want to do is add a new font. There are plenty of fonts out there in the world, so just go and find your favorite font. Google's font repository, fonts.google.com, is excellent. They actually have some really good open source fonts that you can use without royalty, but you probably have access to other fonts. You can use any font that you want. So just drag your font into the Unity project. So here I have a font that I downloaded earlier from Google. This is the Roboto font, which is an excellent font. So if we wanted to make a change to the text and do the Roboto font, what you'll notice first is that you can't, because this is asking for a font asset and not a font. So this is a true type font that I've imported. That true type font is not something that you can just use with TextMesh Pro. If you want to use true type fonts with TextMesh Pro, the first thing you have to do is convert them over into a font asset. Not very difficult to do. Actually provides you with a lot of additional functionality if you want to do that. But go into Window, TextMesh Pro, and go into the Font Asset Creator. Once you're in the Font Asset Creator, select your source font file. I already have Roboto Regular here because I was using it earlier, but just choose another font that you want to generate. So let's say we wanted to generate this. I have no idea what this is. Comicax font that came from somewhere, and we want to use that for our particular text here. So we'll select it, and I'll go through these settings. If you need padding around your text for whatever reason, you can increase the size of this padding. 5 tends to work well for pretty much everything you need. The packing method is fast. There are other ways that you can do this, but fast is perfect for us. 512 by 512 Atlas resolution. This is just when you generate fonts, it's going to create an image and put all of the letters and numbers for your font onto that image. If they don't all fit, then you just need to increase your Atlas resolution. More often than not, they're going to fit for you though. Character set, if you're using a very specific set of characters beyond ASCII, you would go through and select, Unicode or whatever you need in order to make sure that the font asset creator generates all of the appropriate characters that you want to use. For most of our projects, we're really just going to be using the ASCII characters, not even the extended ASCII characters. So we'll go ahead and do that. We can tell it that we want to generate the kerning pairs, and if you do anything with text, you know what kerning is. That's kind of the space between all of your characters. And after we've done that, we can just say generate the font atlas. And so what you're seeing here is the font atlas. All of the characters that it needed so that we could represent all of the ASCII characters into a particular image. Now this atlas is what Unity is actually going to use to display text. So we'll go ahead and save this. And notice if there are some characters that are in the ASCII character set or any other character set that you're using that it's missing, it'll let you know right here. These are characters that I don't think that I need, so I'm going to ignore that for right now. We'll see once we start drawing some text if they happen to show up. We'll go ahead and save this. And so now this is our font asset. So we will go ahead and put this font asset in our project. We'll go ahead and move to project view assets. I have a fonts directory here, and we'll go ahead and save that here. So now we have this Comicax font that is now in font asset format, and we will go ahead and drag that over to the font asset in the TextMesh Pro component, and there we are. Now we are rendering with this new font, and we can change this text if we want to. Greg was here, and there we are. So clearly this is a font that is all caps because I'm mixing in lowercase and uppercase letters, and I'm only getting uppercase here, so that's the way this font was designed. There are other things that you can do with this. So if you want to handle things like underlay and lighting, to be able to do drop shadows and so forth, you can do that. So I just put an underlay here. We can click to expand that. We can provide an offset for it. And so that will give some more depth to our font. If we really wanted to do that, we can change the color of what that underlay is as well. But that is how we will get text onto our screen. So the next thing that we're going to want to do is kind of position this text at some location where it makes sense. So let's just say that this was our health bar. So we would just say this is our health text. And we would want our health in the upper left corner of the screen. So we could just kind of drag it over there. And cool, there it is. Now, one thing that I'd mentioned earlier is that we want to make sure that this works properly whenever we are working with resolution changes and so forth. So the way that we can simulate that is to go into the game view and select a different aspect ratio so that we can see what things look like. So if we go to 5 by 4, you've noticed that the text moved a bit. You may be thinking, well, hey, we set it to the right aspect ratio. Why did the text move? Well, the aspect ratio that we have now is not the same as the aspect ratio that we had before. So the scaler did its best to try and keep it mapped to where it was based on that. But we don't want to depend on that. And in order to solve that problem, we use anchors. So if we select our text, and we look at the rect transform. Now the rect transform is the 2D transform for objects that are living in 2D space. And this is all based off of 2D XY positions and so forth. One of the components that we have here is the anchor system. So basically what this is saying is, right now you are anchored to the middle of the screen. So this middle anchor that I said we would talk about later, that's where this is anchored. But we want this really anchored to the upper left. So let's go back to 16 by 9. And if we hold on to this button, we'll see the various anchor presets. And there are a bunch. So if you want to have full justification, it would be this. If you want it to be full justified across the x-axis, full justified across the y-axis, stretched out, etc. There are also some others for being able to pivot specifically to a corner. And that's the one that we want here. So we want to be able to anchor our text to that corner. So we will select this one here. Now remember, I am holding down the Alt because I'm trying to set a positional anchor. So now that I've pressed that, I will go ahead and drag my text back to where I want it, and I'll go ahead and resize it to make sure that I'm not taking up more space than I need to. So now that I've done that, if I were to go into the transform system, notice that, hey, I am still basically set where I want it to be. I'm still in that upper left corner. If I go to 3 by 2, still in that upper left corner. 4 by 3, still in that upper left corner. So I have the ability to be anchored to a particular position based on where my anchor is. So you'll notice that for this particular item, my anchor is now this upper left corner. So all of my positional information that the scaler is going to use is going to be relative to my anchor position. And that anchor position can be any location. You would typically want to anchor something close to where you want it to be centered. So in this particular case, it's cool that we have it here, but we may want to say move it down a little bit so that it's not totally in the corner. We can go ahead and check that as well and say, do this in 16 by 9. Yep, still works fine. But if we wanted to have something that's anchored to the middle, we would want to use a central anchor point. The whole point being here is there are a bunch of different anchor points that will define where your object is going to be. Use one of the presets. Typically, the ones that you're going to be interested in are, you'll be holding down Alt. You'll be looking for the ones in the corners, the sides, and the bottoms. Those are typically the ones that most games are going to be using for their typical UI components. If you are building your main menu or something similar, you're probably going to be anchored more towards the middle of the screen. If you're doing health displays and so forth, you're going to be anchored more into one of the corners of the screen. If you're trying to do a dialogue for a user, you're probably going to be anchored more towards the bottom of the screen. And that would be, if you select this Alt, that would be this particular anchor preset here. Now, the text that you create, or any other colors when you're dealing with TextMesh Pro and its similar assets, don't have to be tied to a single generic color. You can also say, I want to create a gradient for that particular color, and then you can provide some gradients for it. If you have preset gradients, which you can create, you can drag those in there. In your project folder, you will find some gradients that you can use. And if you want to create some new ones, you can simply go in here and choose the colors that you want. And if you really want to do something special with your particular gradient, such as create a new one that you can reuse, which is cool, you can right click, go into create, and then under TextMesh Pro, do a color gradient, and then you can do your four corners color gradient or one of the other color gradients and reuse that gradient in multiple things. Now, as I said before, we already have a gradient created. This is a four corner color gradient, and we're just going to drag that one into the color preset. And this one basically has some light colors and some darker colors. A little bit difficult to see here, but the top parts of our font are lighter than the bottom parts of our font, and that's something that you can use. You can basically change that if you want to have something more drastic, but this is the one that I've been using. Makes the font text kind of pop a little bit, so we'll be using that one for some of our text. But if you really want to see something that's a little bit funkier, I do have another color gradient here that is some really neon greenish, yellow, and white, because you don't have to have all of your four corners be the same color. They can mix and vary. So if we go back to our text and we drag our funky colors on there, we'll see that it's changed a little bit. But one thing you'll notice is that it's not neon green and yellow. Now, bonus points for those of you who figure that out. The reason it isn't is because the color gradient is additive blend on top of the vertex color. So if you go to the vertex color and you say, oh, well, I'll just set that to white, now you have your funky neon green stuff. So if you're putting colors down and they're not really looking the way that you want them to, be sure that you go back and check that your vertex color is set to white, so that your gradient can blend right on top of that, and that be the dominant color. Otherwise, your vertex color is going to blend with whatever you have for your gradient, and it may be a little bit lighter or darker or whatever, but this is the best way that you can fix that without breaking your stuff, because you're probably going to change vertex colors for a variety of things later, such as highlighting things, but you want to make sure that if you do that, you know why your fonts are changing colors underneath. So now that we're kind of done with text at a high level, we want to take a look at trying to import other assets, visual assets like images, into our user interface. And to do that, you can simply grab any graphic off of your machine, whether it be JPEG or PNG or BMP or whatever format that you want, and simply drag them into your project. Now, I have an images folder here because I like to kind of keep things organized. So in this images folder, I happen to bring in some other art assets. Now, when you first bring your art assets in, so I brought this thing in to be something like a background. I don't think I want to use this as a background, but this JPEG is a good representation of an image that you might bring in from the outside world. Now, one thing that you'll notice is after you've brought this in, look at your, select it and look at it in the inspector. Now, the texture type is what you're most concerned with when you're building user interfaces. When you bring in something into Unity, it's going to bring it in as the default texture type. And the default texture type is good for 3D objects and so forth, but you cannot use it for user interface components. So if you want to do that, you have to convert it over to a sprite, because the UI is built off of sprite. All of your 2D stuff, if you were building a 2D game, you would have to do the same thing, but all of your UI components have to be based on sprites. So you simply just select sprite, click on apply, and now this component is a 2D sprite that can be used in a user interface. In order to import this, what we need to do is go back to our plus here, UI, and we say we want to bring in some sort of image. And now our image is just this nondescript white square, which is kind of useless. But if we go and take a look at our components over here in the inspector, we have an image component. And image components take sprites. So if you were to take a sprite and drag it into the source image, then you should have that sprite rendered, ta-da, inside of your user interface. Now, we've taken something that's much bigger and brought it into a space that's far, far much smaller. And you can go ahead and scale out your sprites or whatever if you want to do that. That's cool. But now we have this particular sprite in our user interface. Now, similar to the stuff that we were doing with text, if we wanted to have this in a particular part of the screen, we would have to anchor it. Now, in this particular case, it's already anchored to the center, so it's not going to go anywhere. But we were talking earlier about being able to do dialogues and such, so we will go ahead and scale this guy out and just say that, this is what we were going to draw our text that characters would say. They're talking to our player, things show up on the screen, and we want to draw it in here. We want to anchor this to the bottom center of the screen. So holding on Alt, clicking on the rect transform, and clicking on the bottom so that it's anchored, then making sure that it is in the right position with respect to the anchor. So now if we were to switch over to another resolution, 16 by 10, 5 by 4, whatever, our dialogue display area is in the right place. This is a terrible graphic for putting text on because you have a hard time seeing it, but this is the way that you would handle putting text, putting specific images and anchoring them to specific locations on the screen. And you're going to do this a lot as you're building out your UI and making sure that things work properly. Now, one thing that I did talk about earlier, because we were building this user interface so that it would be something that was opaque. You can't see through it. But typically you're going to want to overlay this on top of other stuff So you're probably not going to want to have your background to be opaque. You're going to want to have it transparent so that you can have this user interface sit in your world and not be cumbersome for the player. They'll be able to see through this into the world, and this will be the overlay onto your world. And we'll do that a little bit later when we start building a real game world. But for right now, we're building just a menu screen showing some examples of what we want to do. So this will suffice for right now. Now, one thing that you're going to find yourself doing a lot of is creating menus. And remember, you're not going to necessarily know the scale or size of the user interface that you're building your graphics for. So you're going to want to have your graphics, to some extent, be able to scale with the size of your display. And I know one of the things you're thinking is, well, how can I do that if the graphics have to have a particular size? And there is a type of image or image process for dealing with that, and it is referred to as a 9-splice image. And basically what you're going to do with that is you're going to essentially define the sides, the top, the bottom, and the middle of an image, and that's going to give Unity the ability to allow that image to scale and fill in the middle section while keeping the edges fairly static, so you don't get this kind of distortion as you're scaling your image. So let's talk about how we would create one of those. So in order to create a 9-splice, or to use a 9-splice image that you may already have created, the process is mostly the same. So you're going to go here and you're going to do File, UI, Image. And what you'll do is you'll try and provide an image that you would want to have sliced up appropriately for this. Now, I happen to have an image that I grabbed from Unity, which is this 9-splice image here. And so we want to take this, I've already brought this in as a sprite, and you're going to want to change its mesh type once you bring it in to full rectangle. If you don't do that, you're going to get some weird, funky artifacts, and you don't want to have to deal with that. So if you have this type of image that you're bringing in, that you're going to use for a 9-slice sprite, make sure that it's, of course, a sprite, and make sure you change the mesh type to full rect. Now, once you've done that, go ahead and click on Sprite Editor. And one of the first things you'll notice is you may not have the Sprite Editor installed. Unity has all of its various components and plugins and so forth, and it doesn't import everything all of the time, as I mentioned before. So we'll have to go into the package manager and install this. And to get to the package manager, it is Window, Package Manager, type in Sprite, so that you can find the 2D Sprite package and click on Install. We can definitely see that this was verified for this version of Unity, which is good. Typically, you will want to make sure of the things that you're using that they're verified for the Unity version that you're using. So click on Install, and Unity will do its thing and start importing all of the bits. While it's doing that, 2D sprites in general are very useful for user interfaces, so this is one of the packages that you might as well go ahead and install fairly early in your process, which is the 2D sprite package from the package manager. Because if you're building anything beyond a rudimentary menu, you're going to need to be able to do 9-slice sprites. Okay, so now that that's installed, we have our image. We need to modify this image, so we'll go into the sprite editor. And what we want to do is we want to drag our edges for this particular image so that we are representing properly the borders of this image. So this section we want to remain static, this section we want to remain static, this section, and this section. And once we finish with that, we would click on Apply. And let's go ahead and try that with another image. So we have more than one. We have this other image over here. Yep, here's a scoreboard image. Rounded, non-square images don't tend to work too well, but we'll use this one anyway. So we want to kind of catch that this is a corner, that's a corner, and that's a corner. This image has some artifacts to it as well, so there's going to be some funkiness when this one displays. But we'll click on Apply anyway, and we'll go ahead and bring this into our UI subfolder under Images, and we're done there. Okay, so we'll go back to our image that we had before, which is this guy. And source image is none right now, so let's go ahead and bring in our 9-slice sprite. Now, one thing, let me go ahead and explain this to you. If you haven't seen this before, one thing you notice about Unity is as you click on things, the inspector will change to whatever you've clicked on. Sometimes it's not going to be what you want it to do. So if you want the inspector to be locked to whatever you're messing around with, so in this particular case, we want it to be locked on this image, just go ahead and click on this lock here. So now if I click on the sprite, it's not going to bring up information about the sprite. It's going to be locked to that particular object that I told it to lock to. And if I'm done with that, then I can click on the lock and I can do whatever else I need to. So we'll drag our 9-slice sprite into the source image. And you see here it's kind of chunky because it is trying to fit the size of our sprite with the 9-slice approach. Since it's too big for the size of the sprite, it is trying to squeeze it all together. So if we make our sprite bigger, and the way that we do that in scale is we click on the 2D Rec tool. You don't click on the scale tool, that's different. The scale tool is for scaling the object. We're just trying to resize it here. So we want to click on this 2D Rec tool because we want to get the 2D transform, and we want to resize that. And there we are. Now we are seeing that our image is scaling as we shrink it and grow it and so forth, and that's all good. Now there are several modes that this has. So right now it's set to be a slice sprite. If you went back and changed to a simple sprite, you'd see what would happen there. It wouldn't scale properly. It will scale somewhat rectangularly, and you'll start to get more distortion. You could have it tiled, and if you do a tiled sprite, let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger. Let's move this over. Move this over and make this a little bit bigger and transform. And so you'll see that it's tiling the middle of the image with the original background. You may or may not want that, depends on what effect you're going for. If you were to set that back to sliced, it's basically stretching the middle of your original image. So this section of your image is being stretched in order to make things work there. If you go with simple, you see that it is basically a rectangular transform, and it's just going to distort as necessary to fit what you want. And the other one is filled, and filled has a bunch of different methods. Depending on how you want it to work, it will be close to what you were doing before, but if you want more control over it, you can set how much it's going to fill, where it's going to fill, and so forth. Typically when I'm messing around with these, I am leaving everything set to either sliced or tiled, depending on what effect I'm going for. Filled is great. Filled is a good compromise between what you have for slice and what you have for tiled, because it does not distort the same way that it does for slice. You get a little bit more control over what you want to do. But that is how you will deal with all of your Slice 9 sprites. If you're building user interfaces, this is going to be extremely important, because that's the only way that you're going to be able to get things that don't stretch and distort in weird ways because your images are the wrong size for what you're working with. Now, if we go to the other one that I said it's probably not going to work too well, we go and do another UI image, and we say we want to take this best score. and we will unlock the original image. And this is the one thing you have to remember: if you lock it, you have to unlock it. So we will unlock the original image so that we can get to the new image, and we'll drag best score into the source image here. And you can already kind of see that it's not quite working properly. The edges aren't really lining up, but that's fine. Let's go ahead and click on the 2D Rec Transform, and we can kind of stretch it out. And it does some funkiness, some weird things, because it's just not shaped properly. In this particular case, a simple transform is going to look a little bit better. It'll have some more artifacts. And filled will be about the same. So when you're doing those sorts of things, you have to look at what the transform for your source material is capable of. When you have things that have curves, you tend to not be able to use a regular slice, because slice sprites assume that your edges are square. So when you do that and they're curved and they have these kind of bounds in them, you're going to get some really funky artifacts. This one already had some artifacts in the source anyway, so that's why you're getting some additional funkiness. But that's basically slice sprites. So now we can build some menus and so forth on top of this, because we can resize a generic sprite to something that we really want and put menus on top of it, buttons and so forth. So let's do that now. So we can build out a menu, attach some scripts to it, and be ready to go. Now, one thing that I am doing here, I'm teaching some bad habits. You guys really should be renaming these things so that they're easier to find. But for the most part, we are kind of experimenting, so it doesn't matter as much. But we will go ahead and rename this one to menu background. And we will go ahead and create a new panel, UI panel. And when you do that, when you perform that operation on something in the hierarchy, it will assume that you want it to be a child of that item. So it'll do the right thing of just putting things where it's supposed to be. And we will drag menu background to be a child of the panel. So we click on this panel, and let's see, what size is it. We want to shrink that down a little bit. We don't want it to be that big. We don't want to move it. We just want to shrink it down. And try and get that more towards the center. And now we can take our menu background. So this already had some offsets to it, so we will go ahead and reset that. So now it is center, and we can go ahead and use the Rec Transform tool to go ahead and make this the size that we want. And now we can take the whole panel and move that to where we want it to be. Cool. So now we have this relatively ugly but very usable user interface that we can go ahead and put buttons on. So the next thing that we're going to do with our panel selected, because we want these buttons to be a child of the panel, we'll go ahead and click on the plus here, UI button, and notice we have regular buttons, the old school buttons with, or I should say buttons with the old school text, and then we have buttons that have the new school text mesh pro text, and we like that stuff better, so we'll go ahead and click on these buttons here. And what you'll see here is this really generic ugly button that represents the button that we're going to be making look much better. So for this, we will take a look at what we have here. And actually we want to make sure that is a child of our panel. For some reason that didn't show up where it was supposed to. So we have this button, and it has some text in it, and it's behind everything, so we want to go ahead and move that back to where it's supposed to be. Now this can all be fixed by basically using the same trick that we use when we're working with Photoshop or other tools. Basically, everything is being rendered in the inverse order that it is under the panel. So if we want this button to be rendered after the background, that being we want the background to render and then our button to render after that, we just need to make sure that our menu background is first and our button is second, because we want the background to be rendered underneath everything. So that's a Z-sorting order trick that you'll just come to get accustomed to. You shouldn't see it too often, except when you're working with 2D objects and menus. Sometimes the objects will end up behind each other. Just make sure that the ones that you want to render on top are towards the bottom of your grouping, as opposed to on top, because if they're on top, they render first, and then the other things render on top of them. So what we can see here with our button is that it's composed of two distinct objects. So we have our button object, and we also have our text object. So the text object is a text mesh pro object, just like the one that we created before. And the button is what is going to process the events and so forth. Now, one of the things that we want to do is create our buttons and so forth in Photoshop, or some other tool, GIMP or whatever, so that they match our look and feel of what we're really looking for. While we do have the ability to modify the font and the text and so forth, it's never going to look as good as if we had just gone into GIMP and created the button that we wanted. Now, in this particular case, we have some graphics that we're going to use for the button, and so we're going to use those to replace the source image for this particular button, and it'll just display that particular graphic that we want to use. So we will go and grab a image. We have plenty of these over here. So we'll grab this play button, and that's the one that we want to use. So let's go back onto button. Let's go ahead and lock that in place so that it doesn't change. And we will grab the play button, which is a sprite that's already a 2D UI component, and we will drag that into the source image. And it's a little bit distorted because we haven't resized it yet. And then we still have this text component. We don't really need the text component here, so we can actually delete it without breaking anything, and we'll do that. Now we'll go ahead and resize this button. Remember, we're using the 2D rec tool because we're operating in 2D space. We don't necessarily want to scale this. We just want to resize it. And we can go ahead and move this to some location on the screen. Now, if we wanted to have some text that's not a child of the button, because that would be really weird, we can go ahead and create a new UI text mesh pro text, and let's go ahead and drag this guy over here, and we can just change the text in that, unclick, and just say that this is our play button. We'll go into our fonts. We'll take our Comic Hacks font, put that in here, make that bold, make that a little bit bigger. So now we can take that text and move it up, move it over, and now we have something that is our play button, for lack of a better user interface, because this is actually pretty awful quality graphic. We want something that's better, and I trust that you guys have ample skills to create quality graphics. But now we have a play button, and we want to be able to click on that and get some events. Now, the first thing that we're going to want to do, however, is we want to be able to know when that button is clicked. So if we were to run our game right now and we were to click on that button, nothing would happen. We are actually clicking on it, but there's no feedback from it. And we can fix that fairly simply by changing the way that the button responds to input events. And to do that, we can change the normal color, highlighted color, press color, selected color, etc. of that button. So the normal color is right here. And remember, we talked about before this is the color that is being multiplied against the colors that are already in the image. So white means that it's not going to change those colors. Now we want to have this next color, highlight color, modify the colors of that image. So let's just say we want to make the button a little bit redder if it is clicked on. Cool. And let's say that when the button is pressed, we want to make it a little bit bluer. There. So now this should respond to events, and as we are highlighting or pressing this button, we should see it changing. One last thing that we want to do is, if it is selected, we want to make the button a little more visible that it has been selected. And we'll go ahead and give some green or orangeness to that particular function. Okay. Now in our scene, we'll go ahead and press play. We'll click on it, so now we can see that the button is highlighted and our highlight color is coming into play. That red is being multiplied against the pixel colors. If we press it, it's blue because the press color is coming into play, and it's selected now because it's the only button, so it's selected. Basically, Unity is keeping track of which option I've selected, and that's where this orangeness is coming from. If I had multiple buttons there, the rest of the buttons wouldn't be orange. Only one of them will at a time. So if we add some more buttons and you select another one and it had a different highlight color, then that one would be selected and this one would return to its normal color. But that's basically how we handle having multiple buttons, having multiple inputs. For some of your stuff, you may find that the text makes for a very good button as well. And if you want to do that, you can simply create a new button, but turn off the source image for that button so that it doesn't try and draw the button shape. But you can have the text of the button be the text that you want, and as you click on the text, you are in effect clicking on the button, and that way you can turn your menu into just some text that's saying some stuff. And that's if you don't want to create some graphics, or if you just like the look of the text as the metaphor for your buttons. That's an easy way to do that. It's very cheap to do, and it allows you to move on to do other things. In your sample projects, in the sample code that you've got, there will be a menu scene, and it uses text to that effect, so that you can basically click on the play text quote-unquote button and have that start your game. So that's it for everything with respect to this part of UI. Now let's start talking about how we script the UI, because now we can get these interactions. Now we just need to do something with them. Now I mentioned that there is some basic scripts within the sample code that you'll be able to use. They'll give you some basic functionality, but there's a lot of stuff that you're going to want to do that's specific to your game. So we want to talk about how we can build out some scripts to do all of the things that we want. Now, out of all of these components, one of the things that we've noticed, or that you should notice, is that this particular component, the button, has this on-click component here. And this is where you specify what should happen when this button is clicked. So we can create a script that handles that. Now, I have one here that we'll use for this demo, and this is the Hello UI script. We can double-click on that. And basically what we want to do is whenever somebody clicks on a button, we'll just say that my button was pressed. So this is a generic model behavior that we talked about before with scripting, and it just has a regular public method, my button clicked. Now, in order for us to get the system to use that, because if we were to just go into the button, go ahead and select that button and lock it down, and we were to click on that, we would not be able to use that script in any way. So if you go to Hello UI, you can select it, but you won't be able to call any of the functions in it because the on-click needs to be talking to a game object, and it's going to talk through a game object, pass events through that game object to the component on that game object, which is your script. Because as we talked about before, scripts are just components like anything else. So the engine for eventing won't talk directly to your script. It will want to pass a message over to your game object or to a game object, and then reach that component and tell it to do something. So let's look at how we would do that. It's really easy to do. So we can just come over here and say we want to create an empty game object, and we'll call this game object our menu system empty game object there. We'll unlock that so we can see there's nothing special about this. We can add this script to it by either, same as always, doing an add component and searching for Hello UI. We could accomplish the exact same thing by dragging Hello UI onto that empty game object. Either way would work just fine. So now that we have added it to that game object, we want to go to our button and we want to change that to say we want to use the menu system game object. Now this is something that's in the scene. So we'll select this empty menu system game object, and now that we've selected that, we can go under the function, and what we'll see here is here are all the things that we can do. Like you can talk to the game object, or you can talk to its transform or whatever. What we really want to do is talk to the Hello UI script that's attached to that game object, and we want to call the my button click method. So we'll select that. Now we're pretty much ready to run. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. Okay, so we'll go ahead and click on the play menu to go ahead and get everything started, restart it. And now that we're running, we can go ahead and click on this button in the game view. Click, 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 click. And if we go to the console, we can see my button was pressed. We see that it has been pressed 12 times so far. We can continue to press on it. And every time we press on it, our debug message was printed out. You may want to do some other things in here, whatever you want to do, increasing health, changing colors, whatever is useful for your user interface to do. You do it in your script. You attach it to your game object. You attach that game object into the eventing system here. You call that method here, and there you go. So that's basically how you're going to interact with your user interface, have it calling scripts, and do various things that way. So the next thing that we want to do to kind of wrap up is to have some feedback that updates the user interface based on some user interaction. Now we'll be able to do this for our other gameplay scripts and so forth, but since we're here on the menu, I thought it would be cool to just go ahead and have the play menu update the health counter similar to the way some other event from the game would update the health counter based on some event. So in order to do that, going back to what we learned about scripting, the first thing we need to do is get a reference to the object that we want to change the text of, which is of course this text mesh pro object, because that is what has the text that we want to update. This one in particular, the one that has health, we want to change what the health is saying to whatever we want that player's health to be at the time. So we want to store that away in a script so that when we click on this button, we will send the event to that script, and that script will then change the text that is represented here in the health. So the easiest way to do that, of course, is to modify our menu system. And what I did here was basically add some new components to our script that we had before. So our script here, we just take the Text Mesh Pro user interface component. We want to be able to drag that into our script, make that available to our script. So we make that public so that we get this this dialog here, so we can drag the text into that. Next, we have a counter here, which is the just some random variable that we want to be able to increment whenever somebody clicks on the button. And then we have this public method here, update health, which is just going to increment the counter and then take the text object, which is this text UI component, get its text component inside of it, and then set the health to the word health plus whatever that counter value is. So the way that we would configure that is pretty much the same as what we would do before. So we would go into the thing that we want to click on, which is of course our button, and we would go here and set the menu system, the game object. We drag go back to the button, lock that guy down, drag the menu system in there. And now once the menu system is in there, we want to be able to select from our hello UI, which is the script that we have attached to it, and we want to call the update health function on that particular script so that we can see that health change, cause that all to happen. So if we click on play here, as we click on this, we see that we are incrementing the health for the user. We're really just passing that event around. So if we were going to say have an event that was impacting that particular health object or whatever, in our gameplay loop we may attach that health component to our player manager so that the player manager can update the health so that the user can see what the health is as it's changing. All relatively straightforward. It's all the basic scripting stuff that we talked about before, but that's a way that we can have our user interface tied to an event that updates the user interface that's being displayed. And this will be the same for if we have our health bar, which is a script that we have here, for being able to change what the player's health is that's displayed and so forth. So that's it for the rudimentary user interface stuff. Everything else is all about graphics and changing the alpha so that you can see through this into your scene, and we'll see that in the larger example of a real gameplay scenario. We'll walk through that so that you can see what all of that looks like. But now that we're done with that, we're going to move into our last section, which is distribution, deployment, getting our game into the hands of other users, because we can't give our computer to them. So we have to be able to distribute our game to other users in a way that they can either download it or sideload it or however they're going to get it from their app store and play our game. So that's what's next for us. So let's go ahead and stop this and let's talk about distribution.